Today we are going to be making scallion buns. These are one of my absolute favorite Taiwanese bakery breads. Today we're not just making any normal scallion buns because that's boring. Today we're going to be making sourdough scallion buns. This bread is 100% leavened with natural yeast with your sourdough starter. There is no commercial yeast in this, so if you have any leftover sourdough starter that has just been sitting in the back of your fridge for a few months, it's time to break it out. And also time to make use of your windowsill spring onions that you've been sprouting. For this recipe, it's important that you have active fed sourdough starter. So you can see this starter is bubbly. This is really important because our sourdough starter is the only leavening agent in this recipe. If you have starter in your refrigerator, it might look a little something like this with a layer of liquid on top, and you can see the side by side. You want to use starter that looks like the one on the right. In a mixing bowl, combine 150 grams of bread flour with 25 grams of all-purpose flour, 9.5 grams of granulated sugar, 1.5 grams of salt, and 100 grams of active sourdough starter. Next, we're going to measure out 40 mils of almond milk. I'm using almond milk, but you can use whatever milk you have, and 20 grams of unsalted butter, and 1 egg. Begin mixing your dough in a stand mixer with the dough hook attachment and gradually add in your milk. Once all the ingredients look evenly combined, we're going to add in our 20 grams of softened unsalted butter and then just continue mixing again until it's evenly combined and the dough is not sticking as much to the edge of the bowl. Now that the machine has given us a bit of a head start, we can take the dough onto the counter and continue kneading by hand. I'm using this slap and fold method where you just take a corner of the dough, slap it onto your counter, and then fold it in half. And this motion is just going to help develop the gluten in the dough. You can continually perform a window pane test, which is where you take a piece of the dough and stretch it out thinly to see if you can see light through it. As you can see, my dough broke really easily, which means that it's not strong enough and the gluten hasn't been developed enough. So just continue kneading until it looks like this, where your dough can stretch out to be really thin and you can see light through it and it doesn't break as easily. Shape the dough into a ball and put it into a mixing bowl, cover it, and we're going to let it rise for about 2 hours. Once the dough has been proofed, we can take it out and divide it into 6 equal portions, which will be about 66 grams each. Okay, next we're going to shape the buns. Basically, you want to take a piece of dough and roll it out flat until it's this oval shape. Starting from the top of the oval, you want to roll inwards on itself and kind of pinch or press down with each roll so that the bun is tightly rolled. Just pinch the seams closed and also pinch the ends, and you'll end up with this like round rolled shape with tapered ends, basically. Alright, next it's time to break out your giant scary cleaver that every Asian kitchen has, and we're going to score these buns. For real though, I don't recommend using such a large cleaver for this part. I'm just using this because it's the sharpest knife we have in our kitchen. You basically just need a sharp blade. Ideally, a razor blade would work great because it's small, and honestly using this cleaver was a little bit terrifying and I was scared that I was going to cut my fingers off. So place each bun onto the baking sheet, evenly spaced, and then you're going to hold the sides of the bun with one hand and then use the cleaver or whatever knife you're using to make a deep slash across the middle of the bun. You want to make sure that you cut deep enough because this will help the buns open up nicely in their second proof. The buns have been scored. We are going to put it into the oven. Non-preheated oven. I repeat, the oven should not be turned on for this part. Just put it into the oven and let it proof for another 2 hours. Towards the end of your proof time, you can take the buns out of the oven and then preheat your oven to 190 degrees Celsius or 375 degrees Fahrenheit. And then we can make our scallion mixture, which is going to use white pepper, salt, 1 egg, 15 grams of olive oil or any neutral flavored oil, and 50 grams of scallions. Place them into a bowl and then add in all the other ingredients and mix until evenly combined. Because of the cut we made earlier, the buns have a nice flat top for the scallion mixture to rest on. So just top each bun with a big spoonful of the scallion mixture, and if they fall off, it's okay. Just try and keep them on top, and then you can also kind of brush the leftover egg oil mixture around the sides of the bun, which will give it a nice sheen as it bakes up in the oven. So now we can bake the buns at 375 degrees for about 15 to 16 minutes or until they look golden brown and beautiful. And these are the finished buns! I'm so happy with how they turned out. The outside got really nice and crispy while the inside is really soft and fluffy. As you can see, my family literally pounced on them as soon as they were out of the oven. It smells super fragrant because of the scallions, and they are just the perfect size for carrying out on a picnic or for breakfast. They were just absolutely delicious, and I highly recommend that you make them. If your family hasn't eaten them all within seconds of taking them out of the oven, you can take them out and put them on a wire rack to cool. I will note that if you are going for a more traditional Taiwanese bread flavor, I would recommend increasing the sugar, and also in order to get that nice glistening glow of a lot of buns that you see at the bakery, you can brush melted butter on top of the buns as soon as they come out of the oven. I'm going to talk a little bit about how exactly I converted this recipe to incorporate sourdough starter, which is something that I started doing a lot about mid-quarantine, like probably May, because I ran out of my instant and active dry yeast. And the great thing is that sourdough starter is so versatile. You can use it for so many other things other than just traditional sourdough bread. You can basically substitute it in any single recipe that calls for commercial yeast. You just have to make sure to convert the recipe accordingly. So this recipe started off with 200 grams of high gluten flour or bread flour, and it calls for 90 mils of milk. So whenever you look at a recipe, you want to first look at the flour and the liquid content, because sourdough starter is flour and water. You're also going to want to look at the amount of yeast that the recipe uses. So the original recipe only called for 1.5 grams of instant yeast, which is not a whole lot. So I decided I would incorporate 100 grams of my sourdough starter in here. Keep in mind my starter is 100% hydration, which means that it's equal parts flour and water. If your sourdough starter is not equal parts flour and water, for example, if it's a lower hydration, you're going to want to adjust accordingly. I hope this makes sense. So since I'm using 100 grams of sourdough starter, that means that in my starter there's 50 grams of flour and 50 grams of water. That means that I'm going to subtract 50 grams of flour from the original recipe and 50 grams of liquid from my original recipe. That is how I ended up with 150 grams of bread flour and 40 mils of milk instead of the original 290. Every time you convert a recipe from using commercial yeast to sourdough starter, you're going to have to account for extra time for the bread to rise, because sourdough starter just doesn't work as fast as commercial yeast. So when you look at the recipe and it says how long you should let your bread proof for, you're probably going to want to double those times just to be safe. That's just important to know for when you are about to attempt the recipe, so you know how long it's going to take you. Again, I'm not an expert on this at all. I only just started doing this a couple months ago, and this is probably not like a super accurate scientific way of doing it. This is just the way that I've done it, and it has worked for me. Alright, I hope you enjoyed going on this baking adventure with me today. I had a great time. These breads are so delicious.